Okay, good morning to all of you. I see it's 10 o'clock, so at least in Belgium, it's 11 o'clock at your place. So let's start for a new session. Also, today we have foreseen 3 sessions, so now one in the morning and then two in the afternoon. So yesterday we had some general introductions on soil pollution, considering what is a soil, considering legislation, considering how to handle data. In the afternoon, Jill presented us how to have sampling and sampling strategies when it comes to fertility and agronomy, so more on the agricultural side. This morning, Ilse will present more contaminated soil research, but then sampling strategy and guidelines when it comes to contamination. I think yesterday we already received a question, Ilse, how, for example, to go on with creators, but I'm sure you will cover some of those things as well. And once again, I invite everyone, if there are questions, please put them in a chat. We will stop at some point, and then we will have the ability to give your questions, and for you, Ilse, then to give some answers. Please proceed. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Christophe. I don't have anything to add anymore. So I have again some troubles with them. Okay, yeah, okay. So the main objective for this session of today is discuss the design of the sampling strategy and the sampling campaign, the way how fieldwork is assigned, to present guidelines on how to take a sample that is as qualitative as possible, and to carry out field measurements. So with the exception of the design of the sample strategy, the content of this part is in fact a part of the field training, which is foreseen at the end of November. Important to mention is that when performing a sampling campaign, you have always to keep in mind that accurate sampling is critical for obtaining representative data for agricultural, environmental, or even construction purposes. So as only a limited number of samples is selected for analysis, these samples must be sufficiently representative. So let's start with the design of the sampling strategy. When designing a sampling strategy or a sampling campaign, the following elements must be covered. So key elements are where to sample, what's the location and the depth, which matrices do we have to sample, soil, groundwater, or others. How are we going to take the sample? Which techniques are we going to apply? How many samples do we need? And also very important, what are the target parameters for the chemical analysis? With respect to the number of samples is a function of the type of the soil investigation, especially in Flanders. So yesterday I already illustrated the difference or discussed the difference between preliminary soil research, descriptive soil research, or combined soil research. So the type of soil research gives also guidelines with respect to the number of samples. What's the surface area of the study area? Do we have to deal with the homogeneous or heterogeneous pollution? What's the number of the expected locations at risk? And what's the surface area of these expected source zones? All these criteria are important to take into account when defining the number of samples. Yesterday, I already mentioned, or I concluded with the fact that with respect to post-war soil research, a step-by-step multidisciplinary approach combining preliminary and descriptive soil research is the most appropriate way to go. Yesterday, I already posed some questions. I don't know if there is already a reaction on it, but I will ask them again. Are there already sampling strategies drafted for your country? Do you make a distinction between respectively new and historical contamination? And is there a distinction between a preliminary and descriptive soil research? Conducting soil research in post-war zones, as in your country, is complex and challenging due to the widespread contamination from the military conflict, infrastructure damage, and the presence of unexploded ordnance or UXOs. The strategy to be followed must consider the different aspects of soil contamination research, aspects that were illustrated already yesterday for the Flemish and the Walloon region. So, which aspects do you have to take into account? The delineation of the sampling area or of the study site. A very important part is administrative and historical research. Resulting from here, we have the identification of potential contaminant zones. Also, war zone risk assessment is very important, which deals with demining and decommissioning of UXOs and the selection of assumed hotspots. A phase that is already, or a research that is already going on in your country, which was illustrated by the presentation of Nathan. So, and after gathering information, then we can start to draft a sampling strategy. Once we have a sampling strategy, we can start with the execution of a soil and groundwater monitoring campaign. Afterwards, we have to interpret the results, we have to assess a risk evaluation, and then in the end, we have to identify hotspots for which remediation and/or mitigation actions are urgent. But at first, before exploring possible sampling designs and explaining sampling guidelines, I'd like to start with some important terminology when conducting soil contaminant research. So within soil contaminant research, a differentiation is made between source zones versus spreading zones. And here the picture on the left side, we see some asterisks, and that are indicating former smelters in the Campine area of Belgium. So these were hotspots of heavy metal concentrations, and the blue zone is typically the spreading zone, the zone influenced by, in this case, diffuse contamination. At the right-hand side, we see a located spot, a source zone, with then the resulting plume zones of the groundwater, but also at the top, we have a spreading zone of the contamination in the soil. Of course, this distinction is very important when conducting contaminant research, and especially regarding the possible remediation efforts. So the remediation efforts for source zones and plume zones can differ. At first, of course, the source zones are the most important targets of the remediation efforts. Now, how to define the source zones? Hereby, a distinction must be made between LNAPL, DNAPL, and other pollutants. So, in general, source zones are characterized by the location where the highest concentrations of pollutants have been observed. They may still actively release contaminants to the surroundings through leaching or drift. LNAPL source zones are locations where LNAPL residual and pure product is present. As already told you yesterday, LNAPLs are lighter than water, and they tend to float on the water table. So here you see a trench, and the black spot here is an example of LNAPL. They tend to float on the water table, and with changing water tables, it will create a so-called smear zone that can extend over large areas. Examples from NAPLs are gasoline, diesel, crude oil, and kerosene. DNAPLs, I come back to it because it's so important. You have seen it yesterday. DNAPLs are denser than water. They tend to move downward through the vadose zone into the saturated zone. And very important, DNAPLs may accumulate in low permeability zones, fractures, or like in this case, above impermeable layers. Examples are chlorinated aliphatic hydrocarbons, such as dichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, or creosote. When defining a soil sampling strategy for contamination assessment, the goal is to collect samples that accurately represent the contamination levels and distribution in the area of interest. I will repeat it from time to time because it's very important. So for an effective strategy that requires careful planning and execution. And here is how to approach it. So you have to understand the objective of the research. You have to identify on the basis of administrative and so-called historical research the possible source zones and related contaminants. You have to get information about the lithology and the hydrogeology of the site. You have to know what will be the required detail of the sampling campaign. Then you have to consider which sampling designs can be applied. Sampling depth, I mentioned it already. Sampling numbers are, of course, important, but also the sample type that is requested. Are we going for a targeted sampling or a composite sampling? Do we want disturbed samples or undisturbed samples? So, however, you always have to take into account how well your monitoring campaign is prepared. The most appropriate strategy you have drafted may be disturbed through location-specific circumstances. So I said the sampling campaign is depending also on the objective. Yesterday, you see, Gilles guided you through sampling campaign with respect to soil fertility testing. Then you have sampling campaigns in order to for construction works. We are not going to deal with that. We will deal with soil pollution research, and where you can make a distinction between point sources and diffuse sampling, diffuse pollution. Both types of pollution requires a different strategy. Nevertheless, in general, for both point sources or diffuse pollution, the start of a new research or new sample is the delineation of the sampling area. It must be divided into plots, parcels, or subzones. So, and this division is a function of the purpose of the sampling campaign, of variations in soil type, eventually slope and drainage. Also, the land use and ownership is important. Present and past activities will also guide the sampling campaign, and the presence of actual and historical risk locations. So here you see an example of a study area which was divided in different plots, and here you see different oil reservoirs, which of course are important expected source zones. I already mentioned that it's important to carry out an administrative and historical research is of utmost importance. So hereby, you have to consult as many stakeholders and information sources as possible. So you can contact the owner of the site, or if it's another one, the operator, local authorities. A lot of information you can find in environmental permits, like for instance, as build plans, as given below. And environmental permits will give information about the activities on sites, storage tanks, chemical compounds used, and the presence of utility lines and sewer systems. And with respect to your country, also the aerial photographs, satellites image is also important for us, but I think for you it's now of main importance. to indicate the bombing areas, the presence of bomb craters, and so on is very important. Another aspect which may not be overlooked is talking to nearby residents when conducting a soil or when planning a soil research. An important outcome of the administrative and the historical research is getting an overview of possible contaminant sources, the expected pollutants and expected characteristics of the pollution, homogeneous versus heterogeneous, and the presence of L NAPLs and D NAPLs. Related to the conflict in your country, potential sources are the remnants of military activities in bombed out areas, minefields, military base camps, including ammunition residues, explosives, UXOs, and possible chemical warfare agents. Also, destroyed infrastructure is a location with expected pollutions, and especially destroyed refineries and oil depots, ammunition production facilities, buildings, etc. And in this respect, also the presence of storage tanks of different chemicals is important. The potential release of pesticides and fertilizers due to agricultural damage, including the destruction of farms, displacement of soils, and uncontrolled runoff is important. On top of that, also firefighting activities using PFAS foam will have negatively affect the soil. So, and here we see a destroyed oil refinery with the firefighters and the foam. So also PFAS will be expected in your country. So, and then in the red circle, I'm not going into detail on that. It's also, it can be 1 hour extra, but here you see already, and it will not be limited, an overview of the pollutants which you can encounter with respect to the contaminated areas in your country. So different sampling strategies must be followed. I already indicated it, depending on the fact of the contamination is expected to be homogeneous or heterogeneous, and the presence of pure product L NAPLs and D NAPLs. Homogeneous contamination is expected as a result of atmospherical deposition, and for instance, as a result of terrain leveling, with sediment, demolition materials from buildings, ammunition waste, metal scrap. This doesn't mean that in between, okay, you can have differences in concentration, but overall, here you can expect a more or less homogeneous contamination. Then, of course, the different located point sources will lead to a heterogeneous contamination, and adapted strategies are in place when sampling bombing craters and also soil contamination with asbestos, which is morely related to the damage or the destruction of buildings. I already indicated that also another important question related to the drafting of the sampling campaign is the requested detail of the campaign. So I indicated, I think yesterday already, that in Flanders, it's obliged to delineate source zones and to draft ISO concentration lines with respect to soil remediation values and the so-called guiding values, and which are based on concentration. So here on the left-hand side, you see an area where the source zone is delineated, but here we have the ISO concentration line with respect to the guiding values, and they were not able yet to close it. So the question is, how far are we going? Important is that immediately, especially when there is high risk, that the source zone will be remediated. So at a certain moment, it's possible that the question is, okay, we are first tackling the source zones and the spreading zones will be part of a later study, a later contaminant research. So, of course, the level of detail will most likely be determined as a function of available budget and preliminary risk analysis. So the minimal objective must be delineation of pure product zones and or source zones, the delineation of the affected arable land with risk for food production, and the detailed determination of the pollutant load in the source zones. The latter is very important when designing the remediation strategy, but Johan Gemoets will tell you more about it in another session. Okay, it's coming back, but very important, where to sample. Of course, at risk locations, near source zones, with increasing distance from the source zones, taking into account wind directions, groundwater flows, and eventually outside suspected polluted area if you want to have a reference sample. How deep do we have to sample? Sampling depths are function of the research objectives, the type of pollutants, the depth of storage tanks, the groundwater table, and field observations. Surface samples, 0 to 20 centimeter, 20 to 60, 50 to 60. These are mainly taken in soil pollution research related to diffuse pollution or fertility testing. With contaminated soil research, also deeper samples are important, and especially at multiple depths, depending on the depth of the storage tank. So sampling interval, there must be at least a sampling interval 50 centimeters below the bottom of the tank. And this is illustrated in the picture on the right-hand side. We have here an underground storage tank of, for instance, Elnappel, which leaks to, and Elnappel pure product is leaking to the water table. If we only take a sample in the upper layer, let's say the first half meter, then we will miss this contamination. Only when we put drillings deeper down under the bottom of the storage tank, we will be able to detect this concentration. With respect to the bombings, also the depth of impact has to be taken into account. Of course, the type of pollutants, I already indicated, chlorinated aliphatic hydrocarbons tends to migrate downwards, even down the more deeper in the saturated zone. It's depending on the water table and on on-site field observations. So, based on the data and information you collected during the administrative and historic research, you draw the conceptual site model. Accordingly, you can then delineate the potential contaminated zones. You can define the potential source zones and expected substances. You can indicate already an expected contamination pattern, and you visualize, where relevant, the locations of the observed bomb craters. Subsequently, you evaluate the need of chemical analysis for the expected substances in soil and water sample and groundwater samples. Which pollutants do we expect, and which are we taking into account for the analytical package? So once you have drafted this first conceptual model according to all information you gathered, then you can go over and start to draft the sampling strategy. So, and this slide, it's illustrating different sampling designs. It's coming from a draft protocol from, I think it's Lucas Tiffane, who is the first author. So thank you, I took these pictures. So this slide is illustrated different possible sampling designs which can be proposed in soil contamination research. So here, the first one indicates a simple random sampling. The sampling locations are randomly distributed, and the sampling pattern is not typically applied for soil contamination research. Although you can end up in such a pattern, especially in residential and industrial areas, where the presence of underground facilities, structures, and pipelines, the choice of the sampling locations significantly influences. When stratified random sampling is used, the study area is divided into plots, subzones, which has to be done in Flanders anyway. And each sample zone is sampled by a simply random sampling strategy. Another proposed sampling design is the grid sampling. Grid designs are used to screen an entire research site or plot. Samples are taken at strict or regular intervals, and grid designs are applicable for diffuse and expected homogeneous polluted sites. Here we see an example of the transect sampling. With transect sampling, samples are collected along a line, a transect, from a known contamination zone or from a known contamination source. The single transect, however, is not very common, except for overbank sampling and in conjunction with a groundwater plume. Another type of sampling, which is not really indicated or illustrated by a figure, is the history-based or judgmental sampling. In fact, this is also a kind of design we use when we identify source zones, zones at risk, because in that zones, we certainly will put a borehole and a monitoring well. So very important is that the approach focuses on the area-based knowledge of the contamination sources, and it's ideal when targeting known and, sorry, I'm talking still about this. So the history-based or judgment sampling is very useful when you have enough knowledge of the site where you can already locate your samples based on good information. Another sampling strategy, which we use when delineated source zones, is the multiple transect method. This is a variation on the single transect method. And this method is used, as I said, to delineate the extent of source zones or of a contaminated area in general. So the example given illustrates the delineation of a pure product zone, and the first drilling is put in the zone, in the source zone itself. As soon as pure product is found in this borehole, the next borehole is placed at a certain distance away, for instance, 10 meters away from the edge of the presumed contour. And so we will go on further away from the source zone location until we reach a point where no pure product is present. At that moment, we go back for a certain distance. We put again a drilling, and we can go on until we find the contour line of the pure product zone. Of course, we can't do it with one single trajectory. We have to use different trajectories where we put boreholes, and so the results will, according to the results, we will be able to delineate the contour. As illustrated by Gilles yesterday, the number of samples be taken can be calculated using statistical methods. Regarding the Flanders and Wallonia, the number of drillings and samplings with respect to contaminant research are determined by guidelines included in the standard procedures established under the soil decree, and they are function of applicable scenarios. So the first scenario distinguished in Flanders is screening of the overall research site. Another scenario correspond to a suspected homogeneous pollution. Scenario 3 is given by a suspected heterogeneous pollution from which source zones are localized. And the fourth scenario covers a suspected heterogeneous pollution from which the source zone is not localized. So in general, the numbers of boreholes and monitoring wells is given as a function of the surface area of the research site and the potential source zones. So the bigger the area, the more samples you have to take. The more source zones, also the more samples you have to take. And the bigger the area of the potential source zone, again, the more samples you have to take. The number of sample locations also increase when the location of the potential source zone is not known. So the minimum of soil samples to be taken with respect to a descriptive soil research, that's not specified. However, the number should be sufficient to reflect the extent of the contamination, both horizontally and vertically. For each target parameter for which the cleanup criterion for conducting a descriptive soil investigation was needed, horizontal contour lines have to be drafted both in the horizontal as in the vertical direction. So here we have an example where the source zone is delineated based on where the source zone is located here, but the zone where the soil remediation value has been exceeded is given by this contour line. In Flanders, we also have to delineate the zone where concentrations exceeds the guiding values, and this is indicated by the second contour line. The map below indicates an area with pure product. We see different colors, and these different colors are related to different phases in the soil research. And at the end, they still didn't find the complete location of the El Napo contamination, because in fact they have to go further away from the tanks, but due to underground constructions, it was not possible. And now I come to a sampling strategy, which is not common in Flanders. I'm not very familiar with it, so because it's not used here, but it's a structured, statistically supported composite sampling and processing control for a specific volume of soil. It's called multi-increment sampling, or for other media, to reduce the data variability and to provide reasonable, unbiased estimates of mean contaminant concentrations. So that's the difference between the strategies used in Flanders. We are not going to report mean concentrations. We are going to report every time the concentration find at the different locations. Multi-increment sampling is gaining attraction, mainly in the US and in New Zealand, but globally, it's not yet a common approach. But in the US, it's used in military training areas, in post-conflict zones, when you have landfills and large industrial sites. The main arguments of the believers, and it's not negatively mentioned, is that discrete sampling sometimes misses hotspots, what's indicated in the picture at the right-hand side, because the hotspots are indicated with the multi-level or the multi-increment sampling, because it results in a more reliable estimate of the average pollution concentration across its site, and it seems to be cheaper. The main building block, or the central building block of multi-increment sampling, is the decision unit. The decision unit is a clearly identified area or volume of soil or another medium at the scale required for decision making. So it's indicated in the figure here at the right-hand side that the decision units are not only indicated for the surface area, but also deeper down. An example of a decision-making is the need of remediation or the need for a risk analysis to determine whether an area is safe for residential development, agriculture, or industrial use. A decision unit comprises typically a surface area of 25 till 10,000 square meters. As already just indicated, both horizontal and vertical decision units must be considered. In case of heterogeneity, decision units may also be subdivided in sample units. The number and the size of the decision units is determined by the conceptual site model. So here we have a view on the multi-increment sampling protocol. The multi-increment sampling protocol differs from traditional target sampling protocols as mainly applied in Europe in many ways. The multi-increment sampling protocol, as you can see here, involves collecting multiple small samples called increments, typically 30 to 100 per or across, not per site, but across decision unit, and minimum 3 replicates are required. So here the red circles, the blue triangulars, and the blue crosses indicated, in fact, 3 types of samples existing or built up by many multiple increments. Subsequently, all these individual samples indicated here are combined to one single composite sample. The composite sample is then analyzed to represent a mean concentration. How do we do, or how do they design the sampling itself? That can be random or grid-based. So the sampling designs just illustrated can be used here as well. But important is you have a decision unit, you define how many small samples increments you are going to take to make one composite sample, and also the minimum of replicates. It must be 3 replicates. As said, a sample unit is a division of the decision unit. So sample units are not related to the decision which has to be made, but they are part of the decision unit. So here I'm not going through all these pictures. You can find it. I didn't mention it on the slides, but you have a nice report on the ITRC website. I put it at the end of the slides, the reference, where you have a website with all information, all theoretical, all theory behind the multi-increment approach. And here you see, for example, that the decision unit is related to the overall research area. In other cases, for instance here, you have a plot or a surface area that is divided into different decision units. And here the decision unit is seen to be heterogeneous. It's further subdivided in sample units. The question here is, for this area, they had to evaluate the specific exposure risk with respect to a single residence. Therefore, they differentiated between decision units for the garden, for the playing area, for the front yard, the backyard, and I don't see here the house. But as you can see also in the other samples, the question posed with respect to the sampling campaign is given, and it's in that regard that the area is divided in division units, and when heterogeneous pollution is expected, the decision unit is further divided into sampling units. So here, and I say it's a feedback from believers. I cannot really judge if what's indicated here is completely correct, but here is a comparison given between the multiple increment sampling and the traditional sampling. So they state that multi-increments are combined into one composite sample, while in Europe, in Flanders, we work with the discrete traditional sampling, where we take single point or individual samples, which are analyzed separately. It's stated that the representativeness of the multi-increment sampling is high because it captures contamination variability across the DU. In relation to the discrete sampling, where they say that the results may not be representative due to spatial variability, which is not covered by taking one single sample. The bias for the miss is reduced with respect to the discrete sampling. The entire DU cover the complete area with systematic increments, while with discrete sampling, we focus on small specific areas. And they said, then you potentially miss hotspots. As already indicated in the former slides, with multi-increment sampling, one composite sample is analyzed for the entire DU, while in the discrete traditional sample, you sample multiple individual samples, each analyzed separately. It seems that the cost of the multi-increment sampling is lower compared to discrete traditional sample, and that the accuracy is higher. It can be true, I'm not sure. I have some questions, some critical notes with respect to the multi-increment samples. So what about deeper soil samples? For instance, if you have to take samples at 10 meters depth, I cannot believe that the cost of increment sampling is lower compared to the cost of traditional sampling. What about volatile samples? You have to put all these small increments together. Possibly, when you mix them together, all the compounds are gone. The delineation of the L-Naples and D-Naples pure product zone, I illustrated the use of multiple transects, but in that case, you need or maximum concentrations, or you need visible elements, field tests to delineate these zones. You cannot do it with mean concentrations. Is it applicable for groundwater samples? I don't know. It's said that the multi-increment sampling is preferred on top of the target sampling because target sampling may mask hotspots. I think you can also pose a question around, especially sometimes if you have like chlorinated aliphatic hydrocarbons, when the pure product is going deep into the ground, then you can have very small spots, very contaminated zones, which go in deep and then spread out. But on top, you can have quite a small area that is contaminated. So it's possible that when working with mean concentrations, that you mask the hotspot. I'd like to see the results of cost-benefit analysis. I'm not convinced that overall, or in all cases, it's cheaper, the multi-increment analysis. So, and the comparison with mean concentrations, I already made. So I don't say, Nathan, I come immediately to you. I don't say that multi-increment sampling cannot be done, but I think you have to combine this kind of sampling with other designs. So you're gone, Nathan?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll be honest. I wanted you to include this in the presentation because it's something I've been grappling with. So one of the real issues, I guess, in my specific project with FAO is addressing soil contamination to agricultural sites by munitions, specifically things like artillery fire and other munitions. So I'm just curious your thoughts then on a specific case like this. So you have a large area, say a farmer's field, and you have impacts by various types of munitions. So mortar fire, I guess there's small arms, I guess there's different sizes of artillery fire, even artillery rockets, these sorts of things. And each of these things has a different sized impact crater and a different sized plume of atmospheric deposition of potentially, say, heavy metals or explosive residues or these sorts of things. And I guess I'm trying to decide what kind of sampling would make sense to assess these sorts of areas. And that's how I came across this multi-increment sampling. Honestly, this isn't something I use in my contaminated sites investigation, but I could maybe see it being useful for addressing surface soil contamination in agriculture in a situation like that. But I would think maybe it would be combined with discrete sampling where you know very well the different decision units, and maybe within the area of a military vehicle that was destroyed, you maybe do discrete sampling. And then areas where you have like heavy artillery fire, something like this could give you a good idea of the surface concentrations of any contamination that was deposited. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it because it's not something I'm familiar with either.
Yeah, that's what I say. I don't say that I don't believe in multi-increment sampling, but I don't think you can apply it everywhere. With respect to the situation in Ukraine, yeah, as we all know, it's very difficult. And I think there you have to combine designs. And for the large area, I think you have to look at grid sampling, whether in combination within the multi-increment sampling. Near the craters, I think you can work more with the targeted sampling. But yeah, I think for really very large areas, I can't believe that the increment sampling will be cheaper. Then I think you more go to a grid sample. And yeah, also normally, yeah, I come to that later. We don't really work with composite samples, but when you are assessing diffuse pollution, also with, let's say, the more target designs, you can work with composite samples. So in Belgium, we work with composite samples with respect to monitoring in case of agriculture issues. So I really think that in Ukraine, and especially for these large areas, yeah, then also the targeted sampling on itself will not be the most suited solution. I think you have to combine. You have to combine.
Yeah, one of the issues I'm finding, or really, is that the plume size from so these munitions impacts have their craters, but then the plume size is usually quite a bit larger than the craters. So in a situation where we have, multiple craters of different types of munitions, and now we have all these overlapping plumes of deposition, perhaps of the contaminants, and I suspect that those plumes are now impacted a lot by the size, and the direction of them has to do with the trajectory and probably the weather and the topography and all of this. So you kind of have this mix. So it's very difficult to decide, say, your transect sampling from the edge of a crater. So which direction do you go in? You know what I mean? Because these sorts of questions are what are coming up that are challenging.
Yeah. When which side, it's true. Normally you have a main wind direction, but of course wind is changing. So let's say when it's mostly northeast, okay, you take most of the samples in that direction, but that doesn't mean that you can overlook the other directions. I don't know whether I'm not a modeler, so I don't know whether an air model would be helpful in this case. But if they would have enough information, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think you first have to make a grid or make a map. And what you also can do is when you take areas together where you have more or less craters, and then also design campaigns, yeah, area per area. But I think you really have to mix designs,
Mixed
otherwise
designs. Yeah, for sure. It seems yeah, it seems like a very different situation than the classic source spreading zone. You know, you kind of know where things are and where they started, and then you can use a lot more kind of logic to work your way through that. I think these are good points, though, with the critical notes. So, I mean, the deeper you go with the multi-increment sampling, I think it falls apart pretty quickly for speed and cost. And then volatile components. Yeah, I mean, we're in British Columbia and Canada. You know, we are very specific about using sample cores to collect samples for volatile components and preserving them in the field using methanol. So something like that just wouldn't, I can't imagine that would work. Or I guess maybe you could combine them, but it would be a whole nother can of worms. And then any other media, I'm not sure, obviously groundwater, doesn't make any sense, these sorts of things. So.
Yeah.
No,
okay, but I think we can discuss it later on. I'm also interested in thinking about a possible solution.
No, I think this is definitely some food for thought. Ilse, there is in the chat another specific question on that. So the question is, in your opinion, what soil depth is correct to background soil sampling for comparison with the analytical data from bomb craters? And it's also said, taking into account that different soil horizons in craters are mixed with each other and sometimes with a parent rock. So that's the first part of the question. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, that's already quite a lot. So I don't see the question in front of me.
If you open, if you go, I don't know if you can see in the chat, you have this button chat. If you click on it, it would appear on the right, but maybe in your presentation mode, it's not working. So do I need to repeat it, Ilse, or was it clear?
No, I will go to my other screen and I hope I can see it. Yeah, what's the soil depth for correct background sampling? Of course, it depends on the depth of the crater itself. And if you have, okay, with respect to the bombing, it's mixing. But then my question is, why, you need to know if it's really a contamination, or if you have already enhanced concentrations in the region before. Then you have to look, but when you have really different soil horizons, you have to take a background sample of the different horizons until the depth of the crater, or even a bit deeper. Because it will be influenced deeper parts as well. But to answer the question with one straight answer is difficult. Everything, it's linked to the location specific conditions, and especially also to the depth of the crater.
Yeah. Okay. And then the second question is related to that. What is the distance between small samples in multi-increment sampling usually?
Also here it's the same answer. I said you have to take 30 to 100 samples, 100 increments, and of course if you have, let's say, a surface area of 50 square meter, if you take 30 samples, then the distance between will be larger than if you take 100 samples. So it's related to each other. What's the surface area of the decision unit? How many samples or increments are you going to take? And then, in fact, depending then also on the sampling design, you are going to every time the same distance, and then I think you have to calculate it, and it's depending from situation and from the number of samples you are going to take. Is that okay?
I think I only see the name in Ukrainian. I think it must be Katerina, I guess, but I'm not sure if the one who posed the question is this answering. Is this an answer on what you want? Yeah. Anyhow, I think indeed also with the discussion with Nathan, it's clear that there are still ongoing discussions on what it is, but that's of course the plan of the training to enhance this discussion. And I think Ilse, you did very well now giving an overview of all the possibilities, but indeed it will be a case by case thing. And I'm quite sure that this will go on in the coming days as well on the training and further discussion on what is the best plan for the several situations. I think is there an answer to be expected for someone? Is still a question?
Thank you, and I understand that is very difficult question.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So
then
perhaps
yeah, yes.
Before having a small break, I can go now to an example of a sampling of a bomb crater itself, and then we can have a break perhaps.
That's perfect, Ilse. Please go ahead.
I know I had a small exercise. Okay, but I will ask it to you, and then we come to the bomb craters. Here I had a small exercise. It's a plot. It's not a huge area as area affected by bombing. We already divided into several plots for you. We have 5 plots. A is a plot where pollution is suspected, but it's undefined. We don't know if there are source zones, if it's heterogeneous or homogeneous. In plot B, it's indicated we also suspect pollution, and it's suspected to be homogeneous. Plot C, a suspected pollution, suspected to be heterogeneous because we know that there are 3 possible source zones, but they are unlocalized. We don't know where they are situated. Plot D, it's again a suspected pollution with 3 source zones, but here we know the location of the source zones well. They are localized. Plot E, there is no suspected pollution. So you don't have to answer it right now, but think of it. What are the sampling designs you would propose for this small exercise? It's normally, we can come back after the presentation to it. So I suggest to move on, or we can discuss it when I give the presentation on the groundwater sampling. Then you have time to think at home about it, so we can discuss it later. So the sampling design of the bomb craters, yeah, we already talked about it. Bomb crater sampling strategies requires a different approach with respect to soil sampling compared to areas that are not affected by military violence. For soil sampling in bombed areas, the sampling design can vary depending on whether you're dealing with individual bomb craters or a surface area with many bomb craters. That was a subject of the discussion we just had. So the goal is to collect representative samples to assess the extent and the type of contamination. You already mentioned heavy metals, explosives, fuel residues, and so on. For individual craters, targeted site-specific sampling design, which is comparable to located source zones, can be recommended. But in this case, both pit and edge, not only edge samples, but both pit and edge samples must be taken. In this case, a radial design, or as already said a few minutes ago, a targeted sampling, however, is not possible for all craters. So a selection must be based on estimated caliber, volume, and depth of the crater. The location, is it nearby the receptors, or are we going to consider composite samples for clustered craters? So here you have an example of a study carried out by Petrushka et al., and the reference is also given at the end of the presentation. So they sampled a bombing crater according to the radial design. They took samples at the bottom, in between, and near the surface. It's not seen well. I think it's about 1 or 2 meters. This is 5 meters. So, and here, as said, both pit and edge samples were taken. And you see that's important because the circled numbers that are samples taken at the depth of the crater. And we see that we also there, we have high concentrations in, for instance, chromium here. Here for G10, we have quite a high concentration of lead, but we cannot really see a good pattern in it. And point that I will make is that, in fact, I also propose to go a bit deeper, to take some samples below the crater, not only of the pitch, but if you put a borehole aside, then you can see also if in the surroundings of the depth of the bottom of the crater, you have a spreading already of the contaminants. Then the sampling design of the bombed areas, as already discussed a few minutes ago, that requires another design. So, or systematic or stratified random sampling, grid sampling, even multi-increment samples. This table is given by Lucas et al. So it's proposed in their draft protocol. So where the points of extraction or where you take the samples are related to the estimated caliber of the ammunition. But until now, they only propose to take samples near the surface, as we have seen by the study of Petrushka et al. It's also important to take deeper samples. An increased number of samples near the individual craters, that's what given here. And of course, the number of samples also here is location specific. It's when the area you are going to study is close to receptors, you probably would take more samples than when the area is in a remote area. When you're going to sample an area where agriculture is foreseen, then of course you are probably also going to take more samples than when it's a more remote area. So, but I think it's really a discussion worth afterwards. I can't give a straight answer. So it all depends. And you have to look at the maps, at the aerial photographs. As I said, perhaps you have to cluster. In between, you can work with grid sampling. Perhaps nearby, you can work with multi-increment. That has to be decided when you put all the information together. So I don't know, we are now 1 hour further, if it's time for a break.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea, Ilse, to give everybody the chance to visit the restroom if needed, take a coffee. And then I propose indeed we come back within more or less 5 minutes for the rest of your presentation. If that's fine with you as well. I don't see any questions yet, so then it's also time maybe to start if there was any questions. So I would propose to have a 5 minutes break and then we come back to the rest of your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Ilse, I see you're back. Indeed, let's start with the part 2 of your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Christophe. So now we saw some theoretical parts about sampling designs. Once you have chosen a sampling design and you have drafted your sampling campaign, to have it run as smoothly as possible, it's very important to prepare a thorough or detailed fieldwork assignment with sufficient information for the field worker. Part 2 covers the various elements that must be documented. So do not overload the field worker with information. Nevertheless, it's very important to share sufficient details for the organization and the conduction of the field work. So minimal, the details given here on this slide should be shared with the field worker. So it's important that he has on site the contacts of his project manager, but also of the site managers. So provide him a phone number and even an email. The use of the site, access and restrictions. So he has to know, for example, use of the site. Is it an industrial area? Is it a residential area? Is it a place? Okay, the bombing craters, that's visual, but if there are other expected elements of post-war conditions, access restrictions, so the open fields are no problem, but for example, when it's an industrial site, where do the field worker have to go and to log in to the access site? What are safety aspects, especially for the research site? What are the expected site-specific characteristics? What type of pavement? Are there utility lines? Is there a service system? Is there the presence of a water treatment plant? Of course, also important, what is the expected contamination? Then, what are the soil conditions? That's important to choose the drilling equipment. The expected depth of groundwater, providing, if possible, a detailed plan indicating where samples needs to be taken, the sample depths, indicating perhaps an overall borehole, if you have it already, a log, what horizons can be expected. Providing also the drilling program you have foreseen and the methods to be used. But with respect to the methods to be used, listen also to the field worker. He knows the methods the best. He can give advice on which drilling equipment is best to use for the specific conditions. What's the depth and the diameter of the boreholes? At which depth the samples are required, if you decided on the field already. And then, okay, that's not tackled today. That will be tackled in November when we discuss the groundwater sampling. Give also all information needed for the installment of monitoring wells. How the field worker has to finish the place of the sampling location. And are there field tests which have to be carried out? Of course, these elements are not limited. As I said, provide him all the information he needs, or she needs, but don't overload them. It seems obvious, but don't forget to ask for authorization to carry out fieldwork on selected areas. Delineate working zone if requested. Use signalization also for your own safety if necessary, and foresee protective measures. Important when you are at industrialized sites, for instance, damaged oil refineries and so on, especially when there's still electricity, when there's still check the presence of utility lines. What's the task of the project coordinator? They have to foresee, or you have to look for information before proceeding of the sampling campaign. He has to ask the owner or user of the site for maps indicating the location of utility lines or sewer systems. And these maps or parts of the maps must be handed over to the field workers and must be present during the execution of the drillings of the sampling campaign. What's the task of the field worker? Do not rely on the maps only. Do not rely on the given information. Try to determine on site if there are really underground utility lines and sewer systems. You can use cable detections, manual pre-drilling. That's more precautions have to be taken when you are using mechanical drilling equipment. So try to check the presence of utility lines beforehand. Safety procedures. Each site should be studied and visited, if possible, prior to the start of the sampling campaign. And afterwards, safety procedures should be revised if needed, or reviewed if needed. In most cases, a minimum of 2 people should be on site with means of external communication to check beforehand the signal strength of your mobiles. Of course, field workers need to be informed about the expected chemical components and possible radiation risks. Hands and face should be washed before and when leaving the site. After the execution of field work, protective clothing should be carefully removed and wrapped to prevent spreading of the contamination. Disposable clothing should be put in a trash bag with the right label, and it's not allowed to take field clothes and other protective equipment home for laundry. Then you bring probably, or you can bring contamination inside the house. Also, with respect to the field equipment, I'm not going to list all of them. I will just point to some important elements. So when you are going to carry out a sampling campaign or draft a sampling field assignment, then it's needed to take with you tools to avoid cross-contamination. You need tools to clean and decontaminate equipment on site. Don't forget a cubitainer to collect rinsing water. Otherwise, you just leave it on the surface area and perhaps you can cause a small new pollution. Cool boxes, and also don't forget cool bricks for the conservation and transport of the sample. Now, in most of the protocols, temperature for conservation is given to be 4 degrees. That's more or less, that's the temperature that can be held in lab conditions, but on the field it's difficult to achieve. So the most important thing is that you avoid that the temperature of the sample increases. But I know, especially in summer times, in winter times in your country it would be different, but 4 degrees is really difficult to achieve on site. I already showed that handheld detectors can be used for utility lines. Of course, don't forget your personal protective equipment. I will come to that later. GPS systems that you can locate where you sample. Appropriate recipients. Ask or contact the lab before. You have to take water with you from drinking water quality, and of course suitable drilling equipment. So here I just have a picture of a cool box. I don't know if any one of you have a critic on that. You can put it in the chat. So here you have the cool box with some cool bricks. But okay, there is something to say about it. Then the personal protective equipment, of course, that's important for the field work itself. We have the general elements: covered shoes, preferably steel cap boots, hard hat, visible vest, ear protection, mask for dust and vapors with appropriate cartridges if needed. Then Be careful. In summertime, sun hat, sunscreen, other sun protections is necessary, but take care when you apply these elements, especially when you're going to take samples in case of PFAS, when PFAS is expected. Don't eat or drink on site or while you're still wearing your protective equipment and your sampling clothes. Use enough disposal gloves during the sampling campaign all the time. So you have to see that you have enough boxes with gloves with you. Then, of course, in specific cases, additional protective equipment is needed. For instance, in the former combat zone, so although demining is already going on, the presence of explosives is still possible. Evaluate beforehand if it's necessary to use a body armor, a blast-resistant suits, or sturdy boots. But I guess that you have specialized working people for that, because yeah, this gear doesn't make sampling more comfortable. When asbestos is suspected to be on the field, then you see a picture here. You have to wear disposable coveralls, a mouth or a half mask with FP3 dust filter, washable boots or disposable shoe covers, and you need to have labels with you, asbestos suspect and asbestos containing. So at the end of the day, you have to put all these disposable coveralls together in a waste bin, and there you had then label with the correct labels. Regarding the expected radiation hazards, where personal dosing monitoring equipment, as indicated here on the right side, but of course, SCK will tell you everything about it in one of the coming modules. So I already mentioned PFAS. What about PFAS? So many sampling protocols have guidelines stating that it's forbidden to wear PFAS-containing sampling gear. But the problem is that nearly everything contains PFAS. So in Flanders, there are no restrictions on rain, safety, and other clothing under the following condition. Avoid direct contact with the sample. Avoid rainwater or rinse water to run off via your clothes into the sample. And clothes used for sampling may not be washed with a softener. I don't know whether it helps so much, but okay. But take care if you have to take samples in case of a PFAS pollution. PFAS is everywhere, so take this aspect into account. So that was a short part, but as said, it's very important to give a good or enough information to the field worker. Now in part 3, we will try to give an answer on how to sample contaminated soils.
Ilse, if I may interrupt, just because you showed this cool box and you had a question. I was wondering before starting the part if we could here.
Okay, I've got it already.
Yeah, because you triggered does anyone has a comment on what you see on the picture? I think it's a fridge box and you see some sample cups, and I think the dirty things on top are the cool bricks, and I think that's your point you want to make.
Yeah, indeed. So this is not really you need cool boxes with bricks, but of course they have to be clean as well. In this case, you have dirt at the bricks, so it's not the right way to handle it. But normally, when you are coming to Belgium, this kind of things we will discuss during the practical training as well. We will show you pictures with, and then we will talk about do's and don'ts.
Okay, Ilse, we got meanwhile another question on this topic. How can the results of the analysis be affected if the storage temperature of soil samples was not maintained?
Oh, I'm not an analyst, so I'm not As of course, for volatile components, it can be perhaps a problem if the sample cup is normally you have to fill in a sample cup completely, but if you have headspace and then you open the sample or the recipient in the lab, then it can migrate. How you say it? Uitdampen, evaporate. Sorry,
Great.
The sample can evaporate. For some parameters like heavy metals, but Christophe, you have to correct if necessary. I don't think that it's much of a problem, but okay, we have to be realistic. The field is not a lab, so you cannot carry a fridge with you. So especially in summertime, it's really. We had that guideline in the beginning also in our protocol, but we had to remove it because everyone was telling we cannot maintain it. They add thermometers in the cool boxes, and it was really, it was not possible. It was not possible. Of course, it's not allowed that when you are on site that you put the recipients, filled recipients, or even empty recipients, that you put them in the sun all the time. You have to put them in a cool box, or if it's an electric one and you have a generator with you on the field. But yeah, it's not realistic to ask it to maintain a temperature of 4 degrees at the field site.
No, I think indeed it's a pragmatic solution, Ilse. So thank you for that. I don't see any more questions on this, so I propose you go to the following part.
Yeah. Oh, it was a bit too fast now. Okay, so as I said, we will try to give an answer on how to sample contaminated soil. Both manual and mechanical drilling equipment are used to carry out contaminated soil investigations. Regarding to the training and today's theoretical session, only the implementation of manual drilling will be further discussed. So here you see an overview. It's not limited, but of drilling equipment, and these we will discuss in the next slides. So I think every one of you knew an Edelman auger. An Edelman auger consists of a conical auger body formed by 2 blades that meet at the bottom of the auger tip. The shape and the dimension of the blades is function of the type of soil that must be sampled. So the auger, I cannot show it right now, but the auger is rotated manually clockwise into the soil. So, and the shape of the body allows and the blades, the shape of the blades allow the soil to be held in the auger body. When the auger body is filled, depending on the length of the auger body, and this is about 20 centimeter drilling depth, it's raised up from the borehole. Important is that when you retrieve an Edelman auger, the auger should be raised while rotating slightly. If you just pull it up, then you have the risk that you may lose part of the sample. Overfilling should be avoided, because when you overfill the auger or the body, when you pull it up, it will cause smearing of the soil against the borehole wall, resulting in cross-contamination and narrowing of the borehole, which afterwards will hamper drilling. When drilling below the water table, it's not that easy, and especially an overfilled auger may experience a lot of suction, making retrieving very difficult. In general, the depth that can be reached, but of course that's depending on soil characteristics, is about 5 meters. When do we use an Edelman auger? An Edelman auger is mainly applied in unsaturated zones, unless the target soil is characterized by a clay and silty composition. In this case, also drilling in the saturated zone is possible. When you choose to apply an Edelman auger, you will get disturbed samples. And so Edelman augers are used for sampling of non-volatile components. Sometimes Edelman augers are also used for sampling volatile components, but that's only possible when it is in cohesive soils and when you subsample immediately at the field with a soil core. So that is the small device you see here. So when you are in a silty-rich soil or a clay-rich soil, then you can take immediately when you pull up the Edelman auger subsoil, and this small recipient is then filled. You can close it and you can bring it to the lab, or as I didn't integrate it, but as Nathan already mentioned, when you have recipients with methanol on the field, you can fill immediately these recipients. Edelman augers are not applicable in hard or gravel-rich soils. Yeah, here that I said already before, sandy soils, about 5 meter cohesive soils, you can go a bit deeper. Then the riverside auger. The riverside auger, the working principle is the same. The riverside auger consists of a hollow, I think I'm on the wrong, no. The riverside auger consists of a hollow cylinder with two spoon-shaped augers at the tip. The diameter is about 70 to 100 millimeter. It's inserted in the ground as you do with the Edelman auger. You see that the auger here, it's a bit, you cannot see it very well. It's a bit diameter is a bit higher compared to the body here. So, and that is to minimize the friction when you put the auger into the soil. As the Edelman auger, it's mainly used in unsaturated zone for taking disturbed samples. Sampling of hard can also be used for sampling in hard rubble-rich soils, not used for sampling of non-volatile components. In the saturated zone, it's difficult because it's difficult to clean every time the casing very well, and the depth is also around 5 meters below ground surface. The gravel auger. The gravel auger consists of a solid steel construction with a diameter of also about 70 to 100 meters, and it forms a more or less closed body. Here, perhaps you can see that the pointed ends are bent outwards, making the borehole larger than the average diameter of the auger body. It's also a little bit elastic, and therefore it's and together with a more or less closed body, stones can be trapped while also keeping finer material inside. The gravel auger is inserted in the ground in the same way as the Edelman auger, and there's also the riverside auger. It's frequently used in combination with Edelman auger, so you only use it in the horizons where you have some stones, some gravels. The rest of the borehole you can carry out with the Edelman auger. Then the gauge auger. The gauge auger, this device is a cylindrical half-open body, where here you can, when you push or hammer it into the soil will be kept here in the body of the auger. At the bottom, it's sharp. It has a sharp cutting edge. The most you see a different diameter, so they are ranging from 20 to 60 millimeters, and the length is depending on the composition and structure of the soil and the research. So when carrying out the drilling, the auger is, as I said, manually pushed or hammered in the soil. So, and then by doing this, the body is filled with the soil. The auger is then completely rotated around its axis, one or twice, causing the sample to be cut off, and then it has to be retrieved to the surface. So as you can see, it's a minimal disturbed sample. So a sample taken with the gauge auger can be used for detailed lithological description. It can be used in it has to be used in moderately cohesive soils, mainly in the unsaturated zone. Because it's open, it's also not so suitable for sampling for non-volatile components, but also here, it's not mentioned. You can use this steel core illustrated with the Edelman auger. The depths 5 to 10 meters, depending on the lithology. And the deeper is, I think then you will need to hammer it into the ground. In highly cohesive soils, it's less applicable due to the high penetration resistance, and it's not applicable in hard gravel, in hard rocks, not in hard soils, or in gravel-rich soils. The baler consists of a stainless steel tube. It's open at the top, and it has at the bottom, what you can see here, it's indicated here, it's a non-return valve. So the baler has a length of about 1 to 1.5 meters and a diameter of 40 to 75 millimeters. A boiler can only be penetrated into the soil when enough water is present. But in our protocols, additional water, I don't know the real name in English, we call it work water, is prohibited. So therefore, it's only applicable in the saturated zone. The casing prevents the borehole to collapse during the drilling. Of course, it's combined with other auger equipment. The other auger equipment is needed to penetrate the unsaturated zone, and the baler can then be used in the saturated zone. So during baling, the baler is raised several decimeters before release. So you are making a up and downward movement with the baling. So during the drop of the baler in the borehole, this valve is raised. So to ensure that the soil can enter the body here. And when you take it up, then the valve closes to prevent the sediment coming out when the baler is raised. When do you use balers? Balers are used for disturbed sampling in the saturated zone. You cannot use it to make a detailed lithological description. If you use it in pure product zones, you have to use additional casings. It's not suitable in cohesive zones, not suitable in hard or gravelly soils, and most of the time is used for the installation of monitoring wells. And also the depth is about 5 to 10 meters below ground surface. Then the core or the ring sampler. Ring samplers are more with these smaller cylinders. So the core samples is typically hollow stainless steel cylinder that is driven or hammered into the soil to capture an undisturbed sample. Here we see larger cylinders. So, and it can be used for both volatile and non-volatile components. So as you can see here, the steel cylinder is hammered into the ground. You raise it up and you can immediately seal these cylinders, and they can be you can bring or transfer it to the lab in this casing. It's not applicable in hard and gravel-rich soils. You can do, but it's not like, here I could ask the same question. It's not the way you put soil samples at the field, but here you see an example of how the samples are uptaken in this cylinder. Another important element to mention, I said, okay, it's used for volatile and non-volatile components, but there is also existing a cylinder, a core sampler with a soft liner. But this soft liner, although they sell it with respect to the sampling of volatile components, but you cannot use it. So don't use this device with respect to sampling of volatile components. Then the last one, which I want to show you, is a spiral auger. It's used in the unsaturated zone, and it's used to go through hard rock horizons. So when you have a chalk or sand, partly cemented sand, then you can use it. The spiral auger is not used to take samples for chemical analysis. It can be used in combination with other augers, and the depth is about 5 to 10 meters. Manually, augers are rarely used. You have the same kind of drillings mechanically, and they are used more frequently. So, okay, you have different kind of equipment that can be applied for different circumstances and different type of samples. So before you go on the field, you have to select the drilling material. Of course, it's always better to have some extra with you, but okay, you don't have to take everything. The choice of the drilling method should aim to cause as little disturbance to the soil's physical-chemical properties as possible. And the selection is based on the geology, the depth of the groundwater level, the desired drilling depth, the presence of stones, debris, target pollutants, the sample type. That's also mainly related to type of pollutants if you need to take disturbed or undisturbed samples, and the need for detailed lithological description. That I have already said. It's another important element to mention is, but that you have seen, that the sampling device would be made of stainless steel or other chemical inert material. And of course, the drilling technique chosen must allow to take representative samples. So, and here you have an overview table, a summary table with different drilling or augers used for manual sampling and when you can apply it. So the first column indicate the application whenever you have rubbles, gravel, rocks in the soil that you are going to sample. Which of these techniques are useful depending on the lithology in clay, silt, or peat, or in sand. Unsaturated zone or the saturated zone. Do you need to take or to carry out a lithological description as indicated with the core sampler? You can, or the gauge auger, you can make detailed lithological descriptions. What's the applicability for soil sampling when you have to take, or when you need to take undisturbed samples? You can take the gauge auger, the core sampler with the plastic liner. The suitability to take samples with respect to the analysis of volatile substances. So I've indicated that the Edelman auger, when applied in more or less cohesive soil and in combination with the soil auger, you can take samples for volatile components. However, the most preferential method is to use the core samplers. The depth, I didn't mention it, but according to the slides, you have seen it yourself. Manually, drilling equipment can be used to reach large depth. In that case, you have to go over to the mechanical drilling methods. So some important general notes. When carrying out soil sampling, avoid not only soil sampling, sampling in general, Avoid external contamination, so work with clean equipment. Avoid spreading of contamination. Avoid cross-contamination. Successive samples have to be taken as far as this can be traced from the least polluted profile to the most polluted part of the profile, or also in between locations. Try to start with to sample the locations that are expected to be least contaminated, and then go back to the most contaminated. This comment is more related to the mechanical drilling equipment. So you are not allowed to use lubrication of wire connections or other supports to put on the feed tubes. Decontamination of equipment. So also on the field, you can start with clean equipment, but of course, after the first sample is taken, it's becoming dirty, so you have to clean it on site. The use of detergents is recommended. Rinse thoroughly. Take a cubitainer with you to collect the rinsed water. So clean water, take water with drinking water quality. The cleaning water, as said, must be collected and correctly disposed. If you have a nearby waste water treatment plant, it's easy. If not, you have to take it back home or back to the company and dispose it where it can be correctly disposed. So how to compile the soil sample? So you've carried out drilling. Then you have to come to the part of the soil sampling. Also here, use clean equipment. And important is that you remove the outer parts of the sample bodies. For instance, also the Edelman auger at the site, you have contact with the borehole. So before taking the samples for analysis, you have to remove the outer part. For each sample, you need a new pair of gloves, very important, and avoid contact with the matrix to be sampled. Per sampling location, you can spread the content of the auger out at the surface. It's indicated here. Of course, this cannot be done when volatile components are one of the target analytical components. If you do it like this, then you lose them before the sample is put in the recipient. So sampling of volatile components should be done immediately. Foresee sufficient spatial distribution. So that's what's illustrated here. Between the different horizons and between the unsuspected versus the suspected contaminated horizons. Avoid cross-contamination when spreading the content of the auger on the field, and do not reuse this plastic for another location. If you use plastic cutters like this, you have to clean them afterwards. So only that I've just said, only the material that not have been in contact with the borehole wall has to be sampled, and you have to put in the recipient. You can use, I don't have a picture of it, a kind of spatula to remove the outer edges and the top and bottom of what's in the body, the auger body. Sampling should be done as quickly as possible without leaving the drilled material open on the surface. Okay, that I've said already, start with the less contaminated part. The transport we have discussed already, always refrigerated. And then the recipients, yeah, that you have to check with the lab here. I don't know the guidelines for your country or for your labs, but here in Flanders, the minimum volume that is requested is 375 milliliters. Important, fill the recipient without headspace, so you have to fill it completely, and glass or stainless steel recipients are recommended as indicated here. although plastic recipients are tolerated as well. And that's when you are using buckets. For instance, if in asbestos contaminated areas, you need large samples, and then it's allowed to use buckets as well. So what are criteria to select samples for analysis? Can we put everything from one profile together? No, you can't. The collection of samples covers a maximum interval of 50 centimeters. It's not allowed to mix different, clearly distinguishable soil types of different soil layers which each other. So clearly distinguishable, that can be distinguishable on color, on composition, or on indications of contamination. So that's in fact what's written here. Adjust sampling as a function of changes in lithology or horizon. Adjust sampling according to results of on-site measurements. We are coming to that later on. Take a sample of every contaminated zone, and take a sample with respect to the aim of the sampling campaign. When we are doing research with respect to atmospheric deposition, at least samples have to be taken the upper 10 centimeters as well. Another important element is to label your recipients immediately with waterproof label or markers. Sometimes the labels are already on the recipients when you get them from the lab. Important is to use a unique ID, project reference, sampling date, location, and depth interval. We already talked a bit about the sampling with respect to analysis of volatile components. Avoid volatilization as much as possible. So use coarse samplers. Use the Edelman auger only in cohesive soils in combination with soil core. Yeah, for the permitted sampling technique, you can look into the table. Recipients needs to be close directly at the field without headspace. Spreading of the sample on the field is not allowed. Then you have evaporation of your volatile components. If you need to describe the sample, the lithology, do it after subsampling with respect to analysis. Partial sampling is only allowed in the lab unless you use the mini sampler, the steel core, and you use recipients filled with methanol on the field. You can use rapid screening methods for selection of intervals, but then you really need to be with 2 persons, otherwise a lot will be evaporated as well. And composite samples with respect to volatile components are not allowed. Sampling with respect to PFAS analysis, also some important elements. Check whether the equipment used may contain PFAS. That's normally done beforehand. Avoid direct contact with the sample. Use clean equipment. So cleaning of the equipment, only water with drinking water quality. The cleaning agent must be PFAS free. And afterwards, if you use cleaning agent, of course, you have to rinse it very well. You can use gutters of HDPE foil, unless when it's damaged, then it can't be used. You can also use clean untreated jute. I don't know in English. I forgot to look it up. So you can't use it when it's damaged, of course. Cool bricks are allowed with sampling PFAS. In some countries, it's not allowed. It's allowed when you have no damage is observed of the bricks, and you can only use bricks with a hard cover. Composite samples, it's not that common in Flanders, but as indicated, it's common with multi-increment samples. As already said, but I will stress it again, it's not applicable for the analysis of volatile components. When in case, and then it's more in the unsuspected zone, when in Flanders also a composite sample is allowed, but when you take a composite sample in a single soil profile, then you can mix a maximum of 3 subsamples distributed over a distance of half a meter. So for instance, when you have a horizon of 2 meters with the same color, no special observations, and it's in unsuspected zone, you can take a composite sample of 1.5 meters, where each subsample can cover a distance of half a meter. Composite samples from multiple boreholes, also maximum 3, and only samples from the same soil horizons, where no pollution is expected, can be mixed. Sample preparation for analysis, it's preferred to do it in the lab. So of course, when you executed a sampling campaign, when you had several drillings, you cannot leave it behind like that. You have to seal it. You have to install clay stops where poorly permeable layers such as clay layers were cut through. After inserting bentonite granules, you have to add some water that they can swell, especially if the ground is very dry. The thickness of the clay stop needs to have at least the thickness of the impermeable layer that was drilled through, preferably a little bit thicker. If drilling was performed in well-drained sediments, you can refill it with gravel, or not with gravel, with more coarse sand. Of course, that sand may not be polluted. Heavily contaminated soil and soil containing pure product cannot be used for refilling. So sometimes on a site, the ground what was brought up is put back into the borehole. That's not allowed when it's heavily contaminated soil. So that's written here as well. So, and if the soil is not visibly contaminated, then in Flanders they allow it to return it. I'm not so fond of that, but it's written as that in the protocol. An important element, it's not always done on the field. It can be done in the lab as well. But if the field worker has enough experience, you can do already the soil description on the field, or if the collaborator, the project collaborator or project manager is also on site, register visual observations, organoleptic observations. Active other observations are not allowed, but of course, especially when it's contamination with mineral oil, also a heavy contamination with chlorinated aliphatic hydrocarbons, you smell it immediately. So write it down. The Linus, preferably description in the lab. Lithological description is important, and then results of on-site measurements if carried out. So here, important, what elements do you incorporate in the lithological description? Of course, you had to write down the color. Then is a question, wet soil or dry soil. On the field, it's wet, so preferably wet, but do it then all the time, wet soil. Otherwise, you will have color differences. If it's really a detailed description necessary, you can use the Munsell soil color card. Sometimes, and that's also important, then you have colored patches, which point to pollution. For instance, mineral oil is dark brown or black. And here you see, I don't know if it's clear, but you see a blue color in the soil sample that's pointing to cyanide. Also, the presence of artifacts, bricks, plastic, metal slags is important. Here you have an example of a metal slag. Shells, if they occur, please write it down. And then the soil texture, that's very difficult. Jan told something already yesterday. How to feel it in the field. You have tests for that, the ribbon soil test, the ball squeeze test. We will do it during when you come for the physical training. But okay, with the contaminated soil, you have to do it when you are wearing gloves, which is not very easy. So I'm not going to discuss it because I see it's already 12 o'clock, so I will skip it. We will tackle it when you're here in Mol. Blanks, an important element. It's also part of the draft protocol of the FAO protocol. I have to admit that in Flanders, it's not common to take blanks. So if you see all these blanks here, if you have to take them, that's a lot of extra analytical effort. With respect to soil samples, we don't do it. What do we do if we have doubts about results? Then we go back on the field. Also, replicates is mostly not done. We can discuss it. You have pros and cons. I think it's because of the pressure of the consultants and the people or the companies that have to pay for the soil research samplings. They don't want to pay for blanks. The field report as the description of the bore profile as detailed as possible, with at least mentioning the field worker, the date of the field work, the ID of the location, the unique names, and GPS coordinates, and so on. A sketch of the field if necessary, or if it gives extra information. The drilling method applied, the depth of the drilling, the diameter of the drilling, the amount of working water that is used. It's normally forbidden, but in some cases you cannot do it without. So that's when you have to install monitoring wells, but we will come to it in the other part of the sampling module. And of course, the lithological description, if done at the field itself. With respect to the composite samples, it's important that you describe very well which individual samples were taken to make the composite sample, from which boreholes they are coming, and the depth of the individual samples. Results of the field measurements need to be incorporated. Description of how you finalized the area, the finishing of the borehole, and very important, if there are deviations needed from the guidelines, if because of site-specific elements you cannot follow the protocol very well, please write it down, indicate why it was not possible, and indicate what you have done instead. And also graphical profile description. Most of the time that's drafted afterwards by the project worker. So here you have I'm not going into detail to it, but here you have an example of, it's not very well readable, but of a borehole description. Okay, and then the last part, I hope, is that okay to you? Because if necessary, I can also incorporate the next time. It's 12 o'clock now. Is it okay that I proceed with this?
Considering the fact that our next session will be at 1 o'clock, Ilse,
no, okay.
maybe it's better then to postpone it to when you do the sampling on the groundwater. I think it will be for next week, if that's okay with you.
No, it's the week after. It's the 8th.
The week.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
it is because that's just the last part, I think. So maybe I would propose, considering the time, that you include this part in the next session of yours.
Yeah.
And this will allow the people now to have a break.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you already very much for this really theoretical and practical guidelines as well. And indeed, a lot of these things will come back when you will be here in Belgium to follow the training session. I think that's good that you mentioned that. Is there any question already now on what Ilse has presented so far?
Yeah, then I just want to conclude one thing. I just said it, but very important. I want to mention that the procedures differ from cookbooks, guidelines differs from recipes, and field situations different from laboratory settings. So what I just said, when you're going on a field, when you are going to take samples, reflect if the protocol or the guidelines that you have to follow can be followed. If not, adjust. And very important, report. Report what is different with respect to the protocol. And then, of course, I'm looking forward to see you in Mol. Unfortunately, it will not be summertime. So.
No, indeed. It will not. No, okay, then thank you, Ilse. I want to conclude here. I see indeed your presentation will be on the 6th of November in the afternoon on the groundwater sampling. And there is only one session in the afternoon, so maybe it's better then that we include that part as well over there for some practical reasons. So, okay. Then I would like to thank you once again, Ilse, for the presentation. And then we have now a break of 1 hour. And then I see you back at your time, 2 o'clock, or time 1 o'clock for the 2 afternoon sessions. They will both be dealing with modeling again. So the first one will be the modeling related to plant uptake fertility. And the second one, again, more on pollution and groundwater modeling. So that are the sessions for this afternoon. And I want to stop here, and then I see you within 1 hour. Thank you.